The Nile gave, and the Nile took away. Every year it rose with near-religious predictability, flooding the land, blanketing it in dark, rich silt. That silt was the lifeblood of ancient Egypt. Without it, there was no harvest, no bread, no beer, nothing but desert. But even in years when the Nile delivered, what the people managed to grow and eat was far from luxurious. Despite the postcard version of ancient Egypt, gleaming temples, fat grain stores, and feasts under starlit skies, the daily menu for most Egyptians was a bland, chewy, nutritionally questionable loop of repetition. The food? Not just uninspiring, often unpleasant. Before we go further, make yourself comfortable. And if you're enjoying this journey through forgotten corners of history, consider subscribing. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see how far this quiet little world reaches. Let's talk basics. Grain was the undisputed foundation of the Egyptian diet. Not flavor, not balance, just grain. Emmer wheat and barley dominated every kitchen, every storeroom, every field along the river. These grains were turned into two things: bread and beer. And if that sounds comforting, don't get ahead of yourself. Egyptian bread wasn't the soft, pillowy kind. It was rock hard, dense, and baked in clay molds that sometimes left behind fragments of pottery and sand in the final loaf. Over time, eating this bread actually damaged people's teeth so badly that even mummies show signs of jaw inflammation and worn-down enamel. And beer? Less a refreshing beverage, more a warm, pulpy suspension, thick, cloudy, and drunk through a straw to filter out the chunks. Spices and herbs existed, but they weren't part of the average diet. They were rare, expensive, and often reserved for medicine or temple rituals. Salt helped preserve fish, but meat was a rarity. Most meals were some variation of gruel, bread, or mashed vegetables when available. Onions and garlic were plentiful and used often, not for flavor, but because they were cheap and grew reliably. It's no wonder that ancient Egyptians believed onions had mystical, even magical properties. If you're eating them every day, you might as well give them spiritual significance. This wasn't a culture chasing taste. It was chasing survival. Food was fuel. Anything else was luxury. The wealthy, of course, had access to better fare: cuts of meat, honey, imported fruits, and elaborate cakes baked with dates and nuts. But that was a slim margin of the population. For most, food was monotonous, functional, and sometimes painful to chew. Even in tomb scenes, those colorful, idealized murals meant to depict the perfect afterlife, you can see the repetition. The same loaves, the same jars of beer, the same plates of onions and fish. It wasn't art imitating life. It was life trying to make peace with its own limits. If you walked into a commoner's kitchen in ancient Egypt, you wouldn't see much of a kitchen at all. No stove, no utensils drawer, no spices hanging in neat rows. Instead, you'd find grinding stones worn smooth from years of use, smoke-darkened walls, maybe a battered storage jar, and if the family was lucky, a small basket of onions or a few wilted greens. The air would be thick with the smell of dust, old grain, and cooking smoke that had nowhere to go. It wouldn't smell like dinner. It would smell like effort. This was cooking stripped to its bones. Food wasn't a matter of choice. It was a matter of habit and survival. The heart of it all was labor. Women spent hours every day on grain alone. They used saddle querns, heavy flat stones set on the ground, and ground emmer wheat or barley by kneeling and pressing with another large stone. The motion was slow, punishing, and loud. It filled the house with a gritty rhythm and left behind flour that was never clean. It came mixed with tiny bits of stone, clay, and dust from the air. Over time, those bits wore down your teeth like sandpaper. Bread came next. Not soft loaves or anything remotely fluffy. The dough was dense, dry, and hard to mix. No yeast packets, no warm water bowls. Fermentation happened if it happened, from whatever happened to be floating in the air. If the dough rose a bit, that was good enough. It was flattened or packed into molds and then baked, if you could call it that, in small clay domes or fire pits dug straight into the ground. Fuel was precious, so firewood was often replaced by dried reeds, straw, or even cow dung. The result? Bread that was more survival item than meal. Gray, heavy, unevenly baked, and filled with crunch. Not from crust, but from contamination. And this wasn't just for the poor. Even in wealthier homes, the same materials applied. Maybe the labor was done by servants, but the tools and techniques were the same. The only difference was access to slightly better ingredients or more frequent meals. The taste didn't change much. Bread was eaten with lentils, onions, maybe a bit of radish or cucumber. These weren't sides. They were all there was. Smoke hung in every room. There were no chimneys, no proper ventilation. Cooking fires were indoors, which meant soot settled on everything: pots, walls, clothes, and lungs. People inhaled smoke constantly, often while crouched low over their food. The act of boiling a pot of barley wasn't relaxing. It was a kind of waiting game, hoping the fire held long enough and the pot didn't crack again. Clay cookware was fragile. Breaks were common. Repairs were crude. Eating was functional. Meals weren't shared with joy. They were endured. You ate to keep moving, to get back in the field, to grind more grain, to survive the day. And sometimes even that wasn't guaranteed. Famine was always lurking at the edges of the Nile's generosity. A bad flood year meant thinner loaves, weaker beer, and days spent chewing on whatever roots could be foraged from the edges of the desert. And yet, the daily struggle to prepare this basic food was an act of perseverance. These kitchens, dark, smoky, bare, were survival engines. Everything done inside them had one goal: to get enough in your belly to face the next morning. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't tasty. We'll keep going next time. There's still dried fish, desert herbs, and the mystery of Egyptian cheese to get through. Sort of. Beneath the pyramids, behind the temples, away from the ceremonial offerings and gilded tombs, ordinary Egyptians lived by far more practical hopes: to make it through another day with something in their stomach. For most, food wasn't an experience, it was a requirement, and often a fragile one. A mist flood, too much sun, a locust swarm, or one official skimming too much off the top could tip a village from survival to hunger. Food wasn't just fuel. It was a risk, a negotiation with nature and the bureaucracy. There were famines, not constant, but when they came, they left scars. Wall reliefs sometimes speak in symbols, but in some places, they speak plainly. Records tell of years where grain dried up, where markets broke down, and where riots spilled into streets. Temples, supposedly eternal and abundant, closed their storehouses. Some priests recorded dreams of drought, empty fields, and skeletal cattle. Even royalty wasn't immune, because when temple granaries run low, the entire spiritual framework of the country begins to wobble. Hunger crept into everything. Into ceremonies, into dreams, into myth. Grain was stored in silos, controlled by scribes and overseers who reported to temple administrators and eventually to the state. In theory, it was a brilliant system. In practice, it was vulnerable to human behavior. Corruption and theft were constant undercurrents. Rations disappeared. Bribes were paid. Bread and beer, usually taken for granted, became commodities that could tilt a household's future. When things got tight, the poor suffered first and longest. But even the scribes felt the tension. When the grain ran out, people got creative. They fished, trapped birds, foraged roots along the Nile's edge. Papyrus stalks, lotus roots, and wild greens became survival food. Fish was common when times were good, but when it was salted, dried, and stored in haste, the result wasn't pleasant. Imagine biting into a chewy slab of sun-hardened fish skin, layered with river grit and preserved in enough salt to burn your tongue. That was dinner more often than not for many. And in those moments, faith deepened, not out of reverence, but out of fear amar. Banar turned to the god. The Azni Warnarn priests performed rituals not in splendor, but in supplication. They called out to Hapi, the spirit of the Nile's inundation, asking for relief, for water, for grain. Offerings were made from what little people had. Not extravagant, just symbolic. When food failed, it wasn't just physical hardship. It felt like the sky itself had stopped paying attention. A famine wasn't a crop failure. It was a spiritual breach. But through it all, the rituals remained. People still baked bread, still brewed beer, still held on to routines, even as portions shrank. The dinner table, if you could call it that, might have featured nothing more than a hunk of coarse bread, a small onion, and a weak beer slurry. But that little meal stood in defiance of chaos. So if the ancient Egyptian dinner table looks repetitive or underwhelming to us today, that's because it had to be. The entire system was built on predictability. One bad flood could undo everything. Not every year fed every person. Not every person reached old age with all their teeth intact. But they kept going, always waiting for the next flood, always trusting or hoping that the silos would hold, always chewing one more mouthful of the same gritty bread and calling it life. And when the flood finally came, there was relief, but never celebration, just the quiet satisfaction of having made it through. Until the next year, until the next risk, until the grain ran low again, and everyone remembered just how thin the line really was. Walk into an average ancient Egyptian kitchen, if you could call it that, and you'd find no counters, no ovens, and certainly no spice rack. What you'd see instead was a small, smoky corner of a mud brick house, often dark even at midday, with a grinding stone, a low fire pit, and a few worn clay pots blackened from years of direct flame. The air was thick with ash. The floor was swept dirt. There were no cupboards, no shelves. Ingredients were kept in baskets or jars, covered with bits of cloth or palm fronds to keep out the flies. Cooking was work. Cooking was survival. And cooking, more often than not, was done by feel, not recipe. Muscle memory over method. There was no menu, no plan, and little room for creativity. Meals weren't designed for taste. They were assembled for function. If you were lucky, you had bread dough rising near the coals and a stew thickening in a pot that had seen better days. If you weren't, you were soaking dry grain and hoping it softened by sunset. Some days, nothing softened. Some days dinner was just rough grain soaked in tepid water, chewed until it could be swallowed. The primary tool in most households was the saddle quern, a simple slab of stone used to grind grain by hand. It was punishing work, mostly done by women and older children, often for hours. It left behind clouds of dust and an end product full of grit. Not metaphorical grit, actual grit, stone dust, sand, microscopic particles of quartz. The bread that resulted from this was more abrasive than appetizing. It filled your stomach but filed down your molars with every bite. Even young adults showed dental wear more severe than modern elders. Water was drawn from the Nile or nearby canals, stored in porous clay jars to stay cool through evaporation. But it wasn't always clean. Boiling helped, but wood for fuel was scarce. So many turned to beer, not because they liked the taste, but because it was safer. Beer was fermented, dense, and mildly alcoholic, and it killed off some bacteria while also delivering calories. Children drank it. Laborers drank it. Even the gods were pictured with jars of it. But let's not romanticize it. This wasn't a cold pint of lager. It was chunky, sour, thick with mash, and probably closer to warm grain soup than anything resembling what we'd call beer. Sometimes families grew their own vegetables, onions, garlic, leeks, lentils, simple crops that could handle the climate. These were the main flavor base for nearly everything, but that didn't mean variety. The same handful of ingredients showed up in almost every dish, over and over, day after day. Cooked in similar ways in the same pots over the same fire, producing meals that offered sustenance and little else. It wasn't food culture. It was food habit. Meat was rare for the lower classes, mostly reserved for festivals, offerings, or funerals. When it did appear, it was usually dried, salted, or boiled. Chickens weren't even part of the equation yet. They didn't arrive until much later. Most animal protein came from fish caught in the Nile, or occasionally ducks and geese if you lived near marshes. But catching them wasn't guaranteed. Raising them took resources and time most families didn't have. Some scavenged for snails or small animals. Everything edible had a role. Nothing was wasted. Cooking smells might have filled the house, but they didn't signal indulgence. They signaled effort. Smoke clung to your clothes, your hair. A good day meant a warm meal and no cracked teeth. A bad day meant watery porridge and grinding stones that refused to cooperate. And on the worst days, when even the bread failed to rise and the lentils burned, there was silence. Just a scraped pot and a house full of sighs. In the end, food was a daily negotiation with time, tools, weather, and heat. There were no cookbooks, no second helpings, and no plating for presentation. Just survival, carried out one gritty loaf at a time. No garnish, no glory, just another evening of smoke, silence, and sand between your teeth. Bread was everything. It filled stomachs, paid wages, honored gods, and accompanied the dead into the afterlife. It was both the foundation of daily survival and the centerpiece of spiritual offerings. But, for all its importance, ancient Egyptian bread was not something you'd want to bite into today. Hard, coarse, flat, and often full of sand. This bread was more survival ration than culinary art, and certainly not the kind of thing you dip in olive oil with friends. It was dense, dry, and frequently tough enough to break a tooth. Eating it was less of a meal and more of a chore wrapped in obligation. It all began with emmer wheat or barley, two grains that were tough, fibrous, and far more difficult to process than the soft modern wheat we know today. Before it could become food, it had to be husked by hand, soaked to loosen the outer shells, dried again, and then ground into flour. The grinding process was slow and physically exhausting. Women, often working in small groups, would grind grain using large stone querns, sometimes spending hours each day just to produce enough flour for a family. The stones they used were not precision tools. They shed particles as they wore down, embedding the flour with grit. That meant every bite of bread acted like sandpaper against the teeth. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a public health reality. Studies of ancient mummies, from both elites and laborers, show extensive tooth damage, worn enamel, infected gums, even abscesses that would have caused chronic pain. Jaws were deformed. Nerves were exposed. Cavities weren't the problem. Abrasion was. They weren't losing teeth from sugar or candy. They were grinding them down on bread. Eating became an act of erosion, and it wasn't optional. Bread was the main thing on the menu. The dough was often mixed with water, and sometimes fermented with sour mash, left over from beer making, which added a little rise and some bacterial punch. It was shaped by hand, formed in clay molds, or flattened into discs, then baked either inside clay ovens or over open fire pits. There were no standardized recipes or baking temperatures, just centuries of guesswork, trial and error, and cultural memory passed down through households. The ovens were simple but effective, dome-shaped, fueled with wood or dried dung, and often built outdoors to keep smoke out of the home. The result? A dense, chewy, often rock-hard loaf that could survive days in the heat without rotting. In some cases, the loaves were so tough that archaeologists have found them perfectly intact in tombs, still preserved after thousands of years. Edible? Maybe. Enjoyable? Almost certainly not. These loaves were made to last, not to taste good. For the wealthy, variations did exist. They had access to more ingredients: honey, figs, dates, sometimes herbs and spices that were expensive and traded over long distances. The bread served at their tables could be flavored, sweetened, shaped decoratively, and used as an offering to gods during elaborate rituals. Some breads were even molded into animal shapes, symbols of fertility or divinity. There are depictions of banquet scenes with carefully arranged loaves stacked like pyramids or arranged in decorative patterns. But this wasn't daily fare. It was ceremonial and celebratory. For the rest of the population, which was the vast majority, the daily loaf was simple, utilitarian, and always the same. It was eaten with whatever could be found: onions, garlic, radishes, a handful of wild greens, or just salt. Protein was rare. Occasionally a small fish, a piece of dried meat, or a boiled egg might be added if luck or trade allowed. Beer, another grain-based staple, was served alongside, thick and cloudy like a slurry. It was drunk through a straw to avoid the floating bits. Together, bread and beer made up over 70% of the average Egyptian's caloric intake. But bread wasn't just food. It was also currency. Laborers on state projects, like those building royal tombs or pyramid complexes, were paid not in coins, but in loaves and jars of beer. Rations were tracked and recorded meticulously by scribes. There were lists, receipts, quotas. Miss a day of work? Lose a portion of your bread. Complain too much? Get less beer. The food wasn't just survival, it was a system of control. Bread was compensation, incentive, and punishment all at once. In many ways, the Egyptian state ran on bread. Temples stored it, bureaucrats counted it, priests offered it, workers earned it, and farmers grew the grain to keep it all going. Bread was sacred in name, but practical in function. It moved people. It justified labor. And its scarcity or abundance shaped the rhythms of life. But no matter how essential it was, no matter how sacred it became, the bread itself never stopped being hard, rough, and often painful to eat. It was a symbol of resilience, but also of constraint. Variety was a luxury, comfort, a rare thing. The bread did its job, but it rarely brought joy. So when we talk about why the food sucked in ancient Egypt, we can't ignore the bread. It fed millions, yes, but it also filed down their teeth, cramped their variety, and turned every meal into a repetitive, necessary chore. It was life-sustaining, yes, but it also reminded them, 3 times a day, that survival came at the cost of comfort. It kept them going, one gritty bite at a time. Let's talk about vegetables, or more accurately, the short and often uninspiring list of edible plants that made up the repetitive core of the ancient Egyptian diet. The Nile gave them fertile soil, yes. It deposited rich silt every flood season, encouraging crops to grow along its banks. But it didn't hand out variety, and it definitely didn't offer flavor innovation. If you could step into a modest Egyptian kitchen 3,000 years ago, you'd find no spice rack, no olive oil drizzle, no lemon zest garnish, just the same handful of earthy, pungent, dependable plants cycling through the pot, over and over and over again. Onions and garlic were kings of the ancient vegetable world, not because they were beloved, but because they survived. They grew reliably in the Egyptian climate and soil, required little care, and could be harvested in large quantities. They were so essential that they were used as payment to laborers, literal rations of garlic bulbs handed out as wages. They were stuffed into tombs, piled on altars, and painted onto walls with the same reverence as jewelry. And for good reason. In a land where food scarcity was always a season away, onions and garlic didn't just flavor food, they filled gaps. But after years of eating boiled garlic paste and onion porridge, Even the most devoted eater would grow weary. The digestive system endured, the taste buds less so. Other legumes made their way into the Egyptian pantry. Lentils and chickpeas, high in protein and relatively easy to store, were eaten regularly when available. These were not exotic delicacies. These were humble, mushy solutions to hunger. They filled the belly without stirring the senses. Cabbages appeared too, though they were regarded with some suspicion. Ancient texts occasionally link certain vegetables to gas, sluggishness, or even minor illness. Health, diet, and belief weren't separate concepts. They were woven together. Some foods were avoided not for taste, but for their rumored effects on the body or soul. Cucumbers and leeks added slight variety, but they too were seasonal and not consistently available to everyone. If they made it to your bowl, it was likely in small amounts and served the same way everything else was: boiled, mashed, or both. Herbs like coriander, dill, and maybe fenugreek were known, but not generously used. Spices from distant lands existed, but they were rare, expensive, and typically reserved for temple offerings or the tables of the wealthy. For most Egyptians, seasoning meant a pinch of salt if you had some left, and hope. Fruit existed, but in moderation. Dates were the superstar, dense, sweet, and energy-packed. They were eaten fresh, dried, mashed, or even used in rudimentary baked goods. Figs also featured in the average person's life, and they were common enough to appear in many tomb paintings. Still, they spoiled quickly and didn't travel well. Pomegranates were more exotic, enjoyed mostly by elites. Grapes existed, and wine was known, but regular access to either was unlikely unless you were living well above the average mud brick house. Food preparation was not a culinary art. It was survival science. The most common technique was boiling. Mash what you could, heat it in clay pots, and pray it was edible. No open flame searing, no creative reductions, no sauces. Just softened vegetables and starchy paste, maybe eaten with a chunk of bread baked so roughly that bits of sand remained in the crust. Olive oil hadn't become widely used yet, and butter wasn't common. Even something as simple as fat was in short supply. The result? Meals were functional. They kept the population going, not happy. This is why the images we see in tombs, heaped baskets of produce, lavish feasts, and neatly displayed fruits, are more fantasy than fact. These were dream meals, representations of ideal afterlife abundance. They weren't daily experiences. For most people, most days, dinner was a bowl of onion mush, a few lentils, and bread dense enough to challenge your dental integrity. That was the ancient Egyptian menu. Resilient, dependable, but exhausting. The same food again and again, year after year. No spice, little comfort, and never enough to turn it into joy. Just enough to keep the gears of society turning until the next flood, the next harvest, the next bowl of mashed vegetables, served warm, served dull, and always the same. Cheese, as we think of it today, creamy, aged, flavorful, didn't exactly exist in ancient Egypt, but that doesn't mean they didn't try. What they had was more like an accidental cousin of cheese. Clumps of curdled milk pressed into crumbly lumps, left to ferment under the sun, then wrapped in linen or sealed in pottery jars. Some of it was fresh, some of it was aged, and some of it, frankly, probably shouldn't have been eaten at all. Texture and taste were less important than preservation. If it didn't smell too awful and didn't immediately cause illness, it was fair game. Most dairy came from goats and sheep. Cows were considered sacred, especially in association with goddesses like Hathor, and although some herds were milked, cow dairy wasn't as widespread for human consumption. What little milk Egyptians collected spoiled quickly in the desert heat. Without refrigeration, every dairy product was a ticking time bomb. Cheese and yogurt-like substances had to be consumed fast, or aged into something vaguely edible but often questionable. The smell alone probably served as a warning system. The consistency ranged from chalky to rubbery to just wet and lumpy, depending on how lucky or desperate you were. In some cases, pots of cheese or dairy mixtures were deliberately buried in tombs. Archaeologists have found evidence of this, including a jar unearthed in Saqqara that contained a 3,200-year-old cheese-like substance contaminated with brucellosis bacteria. Yes, ancient cheese could literally kill you. It's unclear whether it was intended as food for the afterlife or just an unfortunate side effect of poorly preserved offerings. But either way, it speaks volumes about the risk-reward nature of ancient food storage. Still, cheese wasn't discarded as a failure. It was portable, calorie-dense, and easier to transport than fresh milk, even when it didn't taste good, or taste like anything at all. It was used. Laborers, particularly those working on temple grounds or pyramid sites, might have received cheese as part of their rations. Temple priests used it in offerings not because it symbolized abundance or celebration, but because it was practical and symbolic of sustenance. It filled the space on the altar the way it filled space in a belly, efficiently, if not enjoyably. The production process was basic. Milk was allowed to curdle naturally, or through the addition of acidic substances like fig juice. Then it was strained, pressed, and left to dry. In humid months, spoilage was more likely. In hotter seasons, the cheese could harden into an almost rock-like state. Occasionally, herbs or ash were added for preservation, though this was rare and likely not intended to improve flavor. Aged cheeses, if they could be called that, developed rind-like textures and pungent odors that weren't so much appetizing as tolerated. And like most of the food in ancient Egypt, cheese was never about pleasure. It was about making calories stretch. It was a way to turn unstable milk into something with slightly more shelf life and slightly less risk. Eating wasn't about joy, it was about function. If the cheese was sour, gritty, or vaguely pungent, it was expected. There were no cheese boards, no wine pairings, just another mouthful of necessity. So the next time you picture ancient Egyptian food as rich and lavish, remember the cheese. Sun-baked, wrapped in cloth, carried in pots, possibly spoiled, possibly deadly. Not a delicacy. Not a luxury. Just survival in a bowl. Or, more likely, a cracked, unglazed jar buried under the floor of a mud brick home. Freshness was a luxury. For most ancient Egyptians, food wasn't prepared with the intention of being enjoyed. It was prepared to last, to fill, and to keep bellies quiet until the next day. Without refrigeration, even the best harvest could spoil in days. Vegetables wilted in the heat, fish went rancid under the sun, and mold claimed any grain left just a little too long in the wrong jar. Preservation wasn't just a habit. It was survival. And with that came a hard truth. Flavor rarely survived the process. Drying was the frontline strategy. Fish and meat were salted, hung, or laid on stones under the relentless sun until every drop of moisture had been pulled out. This turned what might have been a rare treat into something closer to chewing on salted leather, soaked in river mud. Texture wasn't a concern. Palatability wasn't guaranteed. The priority was shelf life. If it could last a week or a month, that was a victory. If it didn't kill you with bacteria, it was called food. Salt was the great preserver, but it came at a cost. Not everyone could afford to use it generously. The poor made do with over-drying or burying things in ash, sand, or even dung. When food preservation failed, the fallback wasn't replacement. It was resignation. Moldy grain wasn't tossed. It was picked through. Fish that smelled off might still get eaten after soaking in water or being recooked, hoping the heat would chase away the sickness. In many cases, it didn't. Bread was marginally more reliable. Once baked, loaves could last a few days, especially if hardened. But fruit and vegetables had a much shorter window. Onions and garlic were dependable, both for longevity and sheer toughness. Most other greens rotted quickly. Dried figs, raisins, and dates were highly prized. but only the well-off could store them in sealed pots and cool rooms. For everyone else, spoilage was just part of the menu. And then there were the pests. Every storage system in ancient Egypt was a battleground. Mice nested in grain silos. Insects infested fish racks. Worms found their way into flour sacks. Granary workers tried everything: mud seals, stone weights, raised platforms. But nature was relentless. You didn't remove pests. You worked around them. And when infestations got bad, they triggered real fear. Not because of the waste, but because it meant lean weeks ahead. Beer, the lifeblood of the working class, was also prone to turning. Meant to be drunk fresh, it could sour within days. Old beer turned vinegary, sometimes fizzy in the wrong way. People drank it anyway, because they had to. A bad beer was better than no beer at all. Still, the effort to preserve continued. Clay jars were sealed with mud or beeswax. Amphorae were buried in shaded pits, or even submerged in water to keep them cool. Linen wrappings helped insulate some foods. Spices, when available, were used sparingly, not to enhance flavor, but to delay decay. There was no escaping the rot, only slowing it down. And so meals became more about compromise than pleasure. You ate what was available, what had survived the heat, the bugs, and the passage of time. If it was hard, you soaked it. If it was sour, you held your breath and drank. Food wasn't indulgence, it was persistence. No wonder, then, that so many Egyptian prayers and hymns weren't about feasting. They were about sufficiency. They asked for enough grain to bake, enough beer to share, enough left in the pot at night to start again tomorrow. And that's what most Egyptians hoped for. Not a banquet, but a day without hunger. Next time, we'll look at how ancient cooks tried to make this all edible, or at the very least, less miserable. In the cool, dark corners of ancient homes built from sun-baked mud brick, plastered with chalky lime, and arranged in tight rows along dusty alleys. There were shelves, bins, and storage pots, not for treasure, not for scrolls, just for food. Dried lentils tucked into palm fiber baskets, onions strung like beads from ceiling rafters, a few precious scoops of emmer grain wrapped in woven reed mats. These weren't kitchens in the way we think of them. They were storage rooms for survival, corners of the home designed to stretch what little they had into something that might, just might, last the season. Preservation wasn't an afterthought. It was survival engineering. Egypt's climate was cruel to anything fresh. The heat didn't just spoil food, it erased it. With no refrigeration, no canning, and no vacuum sealing, preservation relied entirely on salt, smoke, sunlight, and strategy. Fish were gutted and laid on flat stones to bake dry in the sun, until they became leathery, salt-cured slabs. Meat, if anyone was lucky enough to have it, was salted or wrapped in strips of linen and hung in the shade to keep the flies at bay. But meat was rare, sometimes taboo, often reserved for festivals, funerals, or the privileged. Most homes dealt in the reliable, pulses and grains. Barley and emmer wheat were sun-dried, then ground and stored in ceramic jars, their mouths sealed with mud or straw plugs. Dried legumes, lentils, chickpeas, broad beans were the backbone of everyday meals. They could last for months, even years, provided the jars weren't cracked and the mice stayed out. These staples were compact, durable, and filling. And when the markets thinned or a poor flood left the fields cracked and dry, those old stores became lifelines. Everything was used. Nothing was disposable. Oil jugs were scraped clean with pottery shards. The ashes from cooking fires were collected and reused in plaster or mixed into makeshift soap. Straw from threshed grain wasn't waste. It was stuffed into baskets, layered into fuel cakes, even woven into sandals. Broken pottery got turned into labels, notes, or reused for mixing pigments. Ancient Egyptian households operated like closed loops. If something had weight, it had worth. This image we have of Egypt, gleaming with gold and abundance, was never meant for the majority. Those riches lived in tombs, temples, and the hands of the powerful. For everyone else, food wasn't pleasure. It was planning. Every meal was a math problem. How much could you stretch, trade, preserve, or borrow? How long could the lentils last? Could the flatbread be made thinner? Was there still any salted fish left? That jar of lentils in the corner of a shaded storeroom? It was more than just food. It was the result of weeks of labor measured in sweat, patience, and silence. It was a buffer against uncertainty. A sign that someone had thought ahead, that someone was doing their best to hold the family's future together with a ceramic lid and a prayer. And when the wind picked up and the marketplace emptied out, and the flood came late or not at all, it wasn't gold or grain taxes or statues of gods that kept people steady. It was those jars, those threads of dried onion, those strips of salted fish, the quiet resistance of the prepared, the slow work of staying alive. No feasts, no flavors, no fame. Just salt and shadow, grit and grain, and the constant, unglamorous labor of keeping hunger just one step behind the threshold. There's something strange about ancient Egyptian menus. They almost never changed. Centuries passed. Dynasties rose and fell. Foreign powers came and went. And yet for the average person, dinner stayed remarkably the same. 1,000 years might go by, and a farmer's meal would still consist of a hard loaf of bread, a bowl of sour beer, and if luck permitted, a few onions or a handful of lentils. This wasn't a cuisine driven by creativity. It was a system obsessed with consistency. Innovation wasn't the point. Stability was. That kind of repetition wasn't just dull, it had consequences. Over time, limited diets can break a body down slowly. The absence of variety meant a chronic lack of key nutrients. Malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, and weakened immune systems weren't exceptions. They were expected. You didn't need to suffer from a plague or a battlefield wound to fall apart. In ancient Egypt, a diet built on 3 core ingredients could unravel your health by degrees, especially when 2 of those ingredients came laced with grit. Modern analysis of mummies paints a grim picture. Even those who lived in luxury didn't escape the damage. Their teeth tell the truth. Enamel worn smooth, cracks running deep, infected abscesses pressing into the bone. The bread was to blame. Dense, coarse, and often baked with bits of sand and stone from the grinding process. It turned every meal into slow erosion. Pain was baked into the daily routine. And there were no dentists, no pain relief beyond prayer or poultices. Just more bread to chew through, again and again. Sometimes people ground their grain using sandstone or granite querns, which left behind tiny mineral fragments. These fragments made their way into the dough, undetected, until it was too late. Bread became more than food. It was a daily act of dental sabotage, and yet no one had a choice. There was no soft food, no variety, no escape. It wasn't just about getting enough to eat. It was about how much damage eating could do. Beyond bread, beer offered little comfort. It wasn't fizzy, cold, or clean. It was thick, lukewarm, and murky, less a beverage and more a slurry of fermented grain water. It was ladled, or sipped, through straws to avoid the floating bits. For children, it was sometimes thinned down. For workers, it was breakfast. It was safer than water, but only marginally. And it was made with the same sand-dusted grain. There were even scenes in tombs showing brewers at work, stomping and mixing in big jars, flies no doubt buzzing nearby. Hygiene wasn't a priority. It was a luxury. Fresh produce was a seasonal bonus, not a staple. Vegetables like garlic, leeks, and lettuce showed up occasionally. But there were no rich salads or colorful plates. Fruit existed: dates, figs, sycamore, dom palm. But most were either too small, too dry, or too rare to matter much. What little variety existed came from geography and wealth. A city merchant might get a slightly better range. A rural farmer ate what grew near his hut. And during bad years, even that vanished. People dried out old grain. They ate whatever could be salvaged from storage pits. Some dug up wild roots, boiled leaves, ground acacia pods, anything with calories. And then there was hygiene. Markets were open air and full of flies. Food was rarely covered. Dust blew in from the desert. Water sources were contaminated easily. Cooking happened over open flames or on hot stones, and sanitation was minimal. Bread might sit on the ground before it was eaten. Fish could be left out for hours. Even religious offerings to the gods went rancid in the heat. Tools weren't cleaned, ingredients weren't washed, and food was shared by hand. Illness traveled through shared bowls and communal jugs, but no one had the luxury of waste. You ate what was available, risk and all. There's also a spiritual dimension to all of this. The Egyptians believed food in the afterlife mirrored food in life. So they filled tombs with painted bread, beer jars, and plates of onions and meat. Not gourmet meals, just the same basic staples, forever. Even in eternity, they expected more of the same. There was no promise of divine feasts, just continuity, just survival. It says something that their idea of paradise looked exactly like the daily grind, but endless. This wasn't a food culture built on flavor or enjoyment. It was built on endurance. The recipes were repetitive, the meals predictable, and the pleasure beside the point. To eat in ancient Egypt was to stay alive, not to savor. To survive another day with worn-down teeth, a sore stomach, and a body running on borrowed nutrients. Food was a daily act of resignation, and still, they ate, because they had to, because the system left no other choice. Tomorrow, it would be the same bread, the same beer, the same pain, same food, same problems, no exit, and somehow, for them, that was enough. It's easy to romanticize fruit in the ancient world. Ripe figs, sweet dates, pomegranates bursting with seeds. It all sounds like a pleasant break from bread and beer. The colors alone make it tempting to imagine lush gardens and decadent meals. But for most Egyptians, fruit wasn't daily fare. It was seasonal, limited, and often reserved for those with land, access, or influence. What survived in tomb paintings and royal records doesn't represent the average pantry. It represents what people wish they could eat every day, the idealized version of sustenance, not the lived reality. Figs were among the most common fruits grown along the Nile. The trees were hardy, heat-tolerant, and relatively easy to maintain. But the figs themselves were nothing like the ones in modern grocery stores. They were small, sometimes gritty, and often dried before storage. Texture was inconsistent, and sweetness wasn't guaranteed. Dates, too, were popular in art and offerings, but in real life they were dense, fibrous, and often used more as a calorie source than a treat. They were packed with energy, but chewed like leather. Sycamore figs held a place not just in the diet, but in the cosmos. They were linked to Hathor, goddess of fertility and joy, and often buried with the dead as a symbolic food for the afterlife. Their sweetness was less about taste and more about meaning. It wasn't uncommon for people to endure bitter harvests and still offer them in ritual contexts, because the act mattered more than the flavor. Even in life, their taste could vary widely depending on the soil and the irrigation that year. Not every harvest was a blessing. Melons and cucumbers occasionally made their way into the mix, especially in wealthier homes or temple gardens. These were fragile, perishable foods that didn't travel or store well. A melon was a luxury not just because of its flavor, but because it had to be eaten fresh. And that meant being near the source. Their sweetness when available would have stood out against the salt, grain, and bitterness that dominated the average palate. Grapes existed too, though rarely for eating. Most went into wine production, and the resulting drink was thick, sour, and unrefined, more fermented paste than elegant vintage. Some fruits, like carob and dom palm nuts, were used more for their utility than flavor. Carob pods could be ground and mixed into pastes, or used to stretch other ingredients. Dom palm fruit was woody and fibrous, better for chewing than enjoying. They were functional, edible, and filling, but never indulgent. Access to fruit was deeply tied to geography and status. If you lived near temple gardens or were part of the labor force tending elite estates, you might get lucky during harvest seasons. Some laborers were paid partially in produce, depending on the temple's surplus. For everyone else, fruit was something you saw in markets, too expensive to buy, or in offerings, always just out of reach. Even when fruit was available, storage was an issue. Without refrigeration or airtight containers, it had to be consumed quickly, and that meant those nearest the source ate first and best. Art misleads. It shows beautiful baskets of produce stacked in abundance, but these scenes were meant for tombs, not kitchens. They reflected wishes, not inventories. A farmer might spend an entire year tending fig trees he couldn't afford to eat from. He'd prune, water, harvest, and deliver them, only to eat dried bread and weak beer for dinner. The pomegranate might appear in his dreams or in a prayer carved into limestone, but not in his lunch. Sweetness, like so many things in the ancient Egyptian diet, was rationed, carefully distributed, rarely savored. It wasn't just a flavor, it was a signal, a marker of position, access, and luck. For most, it remained something to hope for, something remembered more often than tasted. In ancient Egypt, preservation wasn't just a religious goal. It was a practical necessity. The same dry air that kept mummies intact also worked its magic on food. Without refrigeration, storage techniques were born out of equal parts ingenuity and desperation. And while the ingenuity was impressive, the results didn't often win any culinary praise. Drying was the most common method. Fish, for instance, were gutted, salted, and laid out in the sun to shrivel into leathery, protein-rich slabs. The result was something between jerky and fossilized protein. It was tough, intensely salty, and often carried the flavor of whatever the fish was dried on. Smoke-stained wood, gritty baskets, or stone slabs exposed to the wind. Insects were a constant problem, so was dust. But food that could last was more important than food that tasted good. Flavor was a secondary concern. Survival came first. Salt played a major role. It wasn't just a preservative, it was a resource. In some regions, salt was even used as currency, traded or rationed like grain. It coated fish, meat, and even certain vegetables, pulling moisture out and extending shelf life. Meat, when available, was sometimes cured with a combination of salt and ash, smoked over low fires to stretch its utility. The taste was smoky, if you were lucky, bitter and acrid if you weren't. Grains were the empire's backbone and were stored carefully in large mud brick silos. These towering storehouses kept the harvest dry and mostly safe from pests. Access to them was tightly controlled, often overseen by temple scribes and bureaucrats who tracked every measure. In theory, this ensured food security for the state. In practice, it often meant rations depended on your social rank and who you knew. The grain itself, emmer wheat or barley, often carried a bit of grit from its time in storage. Bread baked from it tasted earthy and occasionally unpleasant. Pebbles in your loaf weren't rare. They were expected. Even fruits had their drying rituals. Dates, figs, and grapes were pressed into dense, sticky cakes or left to shrivel in the heat. These were used in offerings and ceremonies, or, for the elite, as rare sweeteners in more complex dishes. But the common person received only the dense, fibrous remnants. hard to chew, hard to digest, and probably harboring a few uninvited insect passengers. But if you were hungry, you ate what you had. There were other preservation methods too. Onions and garlic were bundled and hung to dry, and legumes were dried and stored in clay jars. Some households had pits or cool storage rooms carved from mud brick to keep perishables longer. But this was the exception, not the rule. Still, preservation wasn't just about getting through the next season. It was a deeply spiritual practice. Tombs were filled with preserved food, rows of clay jars, stacks of hardened bread, cones of salt, bundles of onions, all meant to provide sustenance for eternity. The logic was simple. If it could survive time on Earth, maybe it could nourish the soul in the afterlife. That's the irony, of course. Much of what was packed for the journey beyond was barely tolerable in the life it came from. But preservation wasn't about taste. It was about continuity, reliability, security, the same values that held up the Nile's economy and Egypt's belief system: preserved, stored, rationed, and repeated. This was food as architecture, a structure to keep chaos at bay. Not joy, not indulgence, just enough to last through the dry months, the lean years, or the next world. Whatever came first. So the next time you unwrap, something freeze-dried or rehydrated. Think of those sun-dried fish slabs and salted figs sitting in a tomb for 4,000 years. Because in ancient Egypt, preservation wasn't just practical, it was eternal. There's something quietly tragic about the ancient Egyptian vegetable, not because it was missing, but because it was everywhere, and yet never enough. The average Egyptian might have had a garden if they were lucky, but what they grew wasn't lush or colorful. It was tough, fibrous, pungent, and repetitive. Leeks, garlic, onions, a trinity of sharp flavors that filled the belly but didn't offer much comfort. You didn't eat for taste. You ate what could survive the climate, what could handle the droughts, the silty soil, the sun. Onions were practically currency. They were offered to gods, stuffed into tombs, used in medicine, and handed out to workers as part of their pay. If you spent your days hauling limestone blocks under the sun, blistered and aching, a sack of onions might be your dinner and your bonus. Raw, pickled, roasted. If it was an onion, it was on the table. Some records even suggest people believed onions had protective qualities for the soul, maybe because they had so many layers. But more likely it was that they were cheap, durable, and never ran out. It's easy to sanctify something when it's all you have. Garlic wasn't far behind. Believed to boost strength and vitality, it was handed to soldiers before battles, laborers before long hauls, and the sick as a kind of pungent cure-all. But for all its reputation, garlic didn't elevate food. It overwhelmed it. When every meal tastes like garlic, eventually, none of them taste like anything. It masked rot. It masked sameness. It was flavor, but not pleasure. Legumes carried much of the weight. Lentils and chickpeas made regular appearances, often mashed or boiled into thick stews or rough pastes. These weren't seasoned or dressed up, just prepared to fill space. They were reliable, easy to grow, easy to store, and forgiving in droughts. But reliability has its downside. Most meals were built from a familiar formula: a starch, a legume, and something sharp from the garden to give it just enough punch to avoid tasting like warm clay. There wasn't much else. Tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, all New World vegetables, hadn't yet arrived. Potatoes were centuries away. Even carrots didn't look like our carrots. What remained were local survivors, bitter greens that stung the tongue, wild herbs with a medicinal aftertaste, and figs or dates when the season allowed. Most of these weren't regulars. They were breaks in the pattern. For the poorest, vegetables were sometimes gathered more than grown, pulled from weedy borders or riverbanks with a quiet hope they wouldn't be poisonous. Sometimes temple kitchens experimented. Royal banquets occasionally featured vegetable pies or sweet cakes made with dates and ground seeds. Those meals were planned, documented, even immortalized in art. But for the average home, variety was fantasy. A week's meals might blur into each other. The same smells, the same textures, the same slow, earthy chew. It was nutrition without ceremony. And yet, people adapted. They preserved what they could. Onions were pickled in brine. Leeks were dried and stored. Some families found ways to ferment vegetables or grind them into spreads with oil, when oil was available. But these were tweaks, not transformations. The core diet didn't budge. Even in tombs, the idealized afterlife often showed the same foods on the same trays, repeated into eternity. The logic was clear. If it fed you in life, it would feed you after death. So vegetables weren't sides or accents. They were the meal. Overcooked, underseasoned, and eaten again tomorrow. Not out of choice, but out of necessity. A daily ritual of repetition, quietly endured under the weight of the sun. There's something oddly humble about a basket of onions. In ancient Egypt, it was more than just produce. It was a staple, a symbol, a fallback. Onions and garlic were the unsung heroes of the Egyptian kitchen, if you can call it that. They grew easily, stored well, and filled bellies when everything else ran out. But beyond their practicality, they held something closer to reverence. These weren't just food, they were infrastructure. They show up everywhere, painted on tomb walls, tucked into offerings, even buried with the dead. Some were used as currency. Others were left behind as food for the journey beyond. To modernize that might seem odd. Who wants to munch on onions in the afterlife? But for Egyptians, it made sense. You brought what mattered. And what mattered was what you could count on. A bulb of garlic was a promise that something would grow. An onion in a tomb wasn't a garnish. It was insurance. They were so common that they slipped into religion almost by default. Priests offered them in temples. Recipes for healing often included them. They were believed to purify the blood, ward off disease, and energize the body. Some even thought they had protective properties, guarding against evil spirits and illness alike. Garlic, in particular, was considered powerful. Sometimes too powerful. There were periods when it wasn't allowed in certain sacred spaces, as its strong smell was thought to be incompatible with ritual purity. Despite how often they appeared, onions weren't elevated in taste. They were sharp, harsh, and raw, often consumed without cooking, maybe crushed with a bit of oil or mixed with pulses. If you were lucky, they were softened in a stew or slow-cooked with lentils. Most of the time, they were just there. Ubiquitous, slightly overpowering, a constant guest at the table, whether welcome or not. They filled you up, made other things edible, and masked the flavor of food that had started to turn. There's also evidence that workers were sometimes paid in onions and garlic. That's right, not gold, not cloth, not silver, just bulbs, crates of them. Laborers at Giza may have gone home smelling like the fields they built their futures on. There are even records suggesting that strikes occurred when rations of garlic were reduced, not over wages, but garlic. Imagine demanding more onions as your labor rights protest. Medical texts also show how deeply embedded these plants were in Egyptian thinking. They treated everything from stomach pain to fatigue. Papyri lists them as cures for infections, as tonics for energy, and as essential to treating respiratory issues. It's unclear how effective those remedies really were by modern standards, but they were consistent. Garlic and onion appeared again and again, like trusted tools passed down through generations. And when you step back and think about it, it tracks. You don't build an empire on luxury. You build it on things that grow in poor soil, don't spoil easily, and keep people standing upright. Onions and garlic needed no elaborate processing. They asked for very little and gave back much. When floods came late, or fields were thin, they were often the first to bounce back. Resilient food for a resilient people. Even in the grandest tombs, where gold shimmered and sacred texts covered the walls, you'd sometimes find small clay models of gardens with onions tucked neatly in rows. Because whether you were a pharaoh or a farmer, your journey still required something that wouldn't rot before sunrise. Onions didn't make the food taste good, but they made it possible. And for thousands of years, that was enough. At some point, the bread stopped being food and started being a problem, not metaphorically, literally. The same bread that had fed Egypt for generations was also slowly grinding down their teeth, wearing molars flat and embedding tiny flecks of stone into people's jaws. It wasn't because they liked crunchy bread. It was because their milling process couldn't separate grain from grit. The average loaf wasn't a culinary experience. It was a dental hazard with every bite. Grinding grain in ancient Egypt meant using stone tools, quern stones mostly. Grains were placed on a lower slab and crushed with an upper one, manually, by hand, for hours each day. Women, because it was typically women, would kneel and grind for most of the morning, every single day of their lives. The repetitive motion was grueling, wearing down joints and muscle over time. But it also wore down the stones themselves. Microscopic shards of quartz, granite, and sandstone broke off during the grinding and mixed with the flour. There was no industrial sifting, no safety inspection, just bread packed with edible sandpaper. Over time, those little bits of stone turned each meal into a dental assault. Archaeologists have found mummies with jaws full of infections, teeth worn down to the gums, and signs of chronic pain etched into the very bone. Flat molars, exposed nerves, root damage, even the soft tissue in cases where it survived showed signs of swelling and abscesses. And there were no dentists, no way to numb the pain. You either lived with it, chewed through it, or gave up eating solid food entirely. This wasn't a problem reserved for the poor. The elite, too, suffered. Even those who could afford more refined meals still ate bread made with stone-ground flour. The only difference was that they might have had honey in their loaves, or a finer mold for baking. But the grinding stones in the back of the kitchen wore out just the same. And so, from the palace to the peasant's hut, everyone paid the same price for the same staple food, tiny bits of their teeth. And bread wasn't the only offender. The entire diet was abrasive. Fresh vegetables were hard to come by outside the growing season. Fruits were a luxury. Meat was rare and expensive. What was left were tough onions, dry lentils, and fibrous plants that made meals heavy, but not nourishing. The fiber count was sky high, but it was the kind that scratched its way through your system. Some scholars believe the average Egyptian consumed almost 80% of their daily calories from carbohydrates. The other 20%, protein, fat, flavor, was reserved for feast days, temple offerings, or the lucky. Beer was supposed to help. It was consumed with almost every meal and provided some nutrients and hydration. But it wasn't like modern beer. It was thick, fermented, and sludgy, more like drinkable bread than a refreshing drink. It had grain, it had grit, and it had to be filtered with a straw to avoid choking on floating solids. It was nourishing, yes. Enjoyable? Maybe not. Even sweeteners, honey, dates, carob, were rare and expensive. Most people's food was either bland or aggressively bitter, especially when the ingredients weren't fresh. And with no refrigeration and limited access to clean water, food could spoil fast. People learned to tolerate the taste of almost off, and a bit sour. Despite all this, the Egyptians persisted. They made art showing ideal meals. They built tombs filled with images of perfect loaves, perfect jars, and servants bringing perfect plates to the deceased. It wasn't literal. It was hopeful. It was a version of eating that didn't involve dental trauma. But in real life, Every meal was a compromise. Food was both nourishment and erosion. Every bite was a trade-off between staying alive and slowly wearing your body down. And still, they ate, because there was no version of life where they didn't. Because the fields needed sowing, the temples needed feeding, and the granaries needed to be filled. Meal after meal, loaf after loaf, year after year, century after century. The bread never got softer, but they kept eating anyway. They drank their bread. Sort of. What passed for beer in ancient Egypt was a thick, porridge-like mix of fermented grain and water, cloudy, clumpy, and never cold. It wasn't filtered, it wasn't bubbly, and it certainly wasn't refreshing, but it was calorie-dense and, more importantly, reliable. Water alone could kill you. The Nile was sacred, yes, but it was also full of bacteria. Beer, with its low alcohol and mild fermentation, was safer than raw water. Children drank it. Laborers drank it. Priests drank it. Everyone pretty much drank it. It was less a leisure activity and more a necessary part of staying alive. Before we go further, make yourself comfortable. And if you're enjoying this journey through forgotten corners of history, consider subscribing. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see how far this quiet little world reaches. Still, beer wasn't glamorous. It was coarse, mushy, and probably a little sour. It didn't come in elegant glasses or golden goblets. It came in clay jars, served with a side of sediment and a wooden straw to avoid the chunks. You didn't sip it for taste. You endured it. And that endurance, more than anything, defined the Egyptian diet. They had onions, that much is clear. Layered, sharp, and stubborn, onions were everywhere, woven into wages, stuffed into tombs, and allegedly strong enough to keep demons at bay. But what they didn't have was subtlety. No caramelized sweetness, no golden browning in butter, no slow roasting for balance. Raw was the style, maybe crushed, maybe mixed into a crude mash. The smell must have been overwhelming in cramped kitchens, if you could even call them that, where smoke clung to stone walls and every surface was stained with steam and ash. They didn't saute, they didn't pickle, and they certainly didn't drizzle anything fancy on top. It was utility, not flavor, function, not finesse. Before we go further, make yourself comfortable. And if you're enjoying this journey through forgotten corners of history, consider subscribing. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see how far this quiet little world reaches. Onions weren't just food. They were symbolism, circles within circles, eternal life, preservation, which is ironic because most people eating them were neither eternal nor particularly well preserved. But they were cheap, they were strong, and they made you feel like you'd eaten something, even if it was mostly pain and eye-watering regret. Sometimes onions were ground into a pungent paste, smeared onto stale bread just to make it feel like a meal. Other times, they were layered into gruels or stews, more for bulk than taste. And for the sick, onions were medicine, used in poultices, crushed into teas, or simply eaten raw as a cure-all. They didn't just feed the body, they haunted it, followed people around in scent and spice, lingering on fingers and breath. Tomb paintings show piles of them. Workers were paid in them. Soldiers marched with sacks of them. In a world without refrigeration, without seasoning, without softness, onions were a kind of defiant flavor. And even when everything else was bland or broken, they could still make you cry. The Nile didn't just feed the fields, it shaped the entire rhythm of hunger. And nowhere was that more obvious than in how Egyptians handled dairy. Or rather, how they barely handled it at all. Milk was available, technically. Cows were milked, goats too. But it wasn't a dietary staple for most people. The climate wasn't kind to storage. Without refrigeration, milk turned fast. It curdled, soured, spoiled. So instead of pouring it into cups, they turned it into something sturdier. Cheese. Or at least something they called cheese. Soft, crumbly, chalky stuff. Probably sour. Possibly smoked. Definitely salty. And it wasn't everywhere. Cheese was more common in temple offerings and high-status households. It wasn't your average farmer's breakfast. It was a bonus, a rarity, something that came along when the animals were healthy and the weather hadn't ruined everything. Most people got their protein from legumes or fish, things that could be dried, stored, and eaten without inviting stomach problems. Even for those who could access dairy, there were cultural taboos around it. Some priests avoided it entirely, considering it unclean. Others saw it as a medicinal item, not an ingredient. You might rub it on a burn. You might feed it to a sick child. But you probably didn't spread it on bread with a smile. Before we go further, make yourself comfortable. And if you're enjoying this journey through forgotten corners of history, consider subscribing. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see how far this quiet little world reaches. Still, cheese made its way into tombs. Jars filled with preserved dairy were sealed and stashed alongside the dead, meant to nourish them in the afterlife. The implication being, this was food for eternity, not necessarily for everyday life. It had value, but not convenience. Prestige, but not popularity. And the flavor? Probably sharp, maybe gritty. Some modern reconstructions suggest it was close to cottage cheese or feta, though that might be flattering. More likely it was strong-smelling, grainy, and acidic. The kind of food that made you squint when you tasted it. Cheese in ancient Egypt wasn't comfort. It was preservation. Proof that something perishable could be stretched a little longer, pushed into usefulness before it turned. It was a metaphor for their entire food system, built on necessity, wrapped in ritual, barely balanced on the edge of spoilage. So when you picture ancient Egyptians eating cheese, don't imagine a banquet. Imagine someone crouched in a mud brick home, unwrapping a lump from a clay jar, sniffing it once, then biting into it with the kind of expression that says, "It'll do." There were no tomatoes, no potatoes, no chili peppers, lemons, or limes, no citrus at all, in fact. The ancient Egyptian pantry, once you get past the mythology and murals, was an exercise in limits. They had what the Nile could offer and what trade could trickle in, but most meals were built from the same short list of ingredients, recycled endlessly. Flavor was not the goal. Sustenance was. So what did they do when they wanted something with a little bite? The answer was garlic. Strong, raw, and unapologetic. Like onions, it was everywhere, fed to workers, buried with the dead, pressed into rituals and medicine. It was known not just for its taste, but for its power. Not spiritual power necessarily, but the power to make a bowl of soggy lentils feel like it had a pulse. Garlic, crushed into a paste or tossed into stews, might have been one of the few strong flavors most people encountered. They used mustard seed sometimes, and coriander. Maybe a little salt if you lived near a drying pond. But the spice rack, as we'd think of it today, didn't exist. Cinnamon? Not there. Pepper? Not there. Sugar? Forget it. Honey was a luxury, and even that was usually reserved for offerings or the elite. Before we go further, make yourself comfortable. And if you're enjoying this journey through forgotten corners of history, consider subscribing. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see how far this quiet little world reaches. Most food was boiled, mashed, dried, or salted. The textures were often coarse. Think flatbreads made from grain, mixed with water and baked on hot stones. Think porridge that stuck to your hands and to your ribs. Think fish dried in the sun until it resembled leather. In rare cases, food was roasted, but only in simple, direct ways. No marinades, no sauces, no side of herbs to soften the edge. You ate what was there. You were grateful when it didn't make you sick. There's this idea, painted into tombs and retold in museum labels, that Egyptians ate like royalty. That feasting was common. But most of that imagery is afterlife propaganda, idealized visions of eternity, not snapshots of real life. In real life, the table was spare, the food was utilitarian, and the flavor, when it existed, was incidental. So when you imagine a meal in ancient Egypt, don't picture a banquet. Picture a clay bowl, a wooden spoon, a hard seat on a stone ledge. Picture a slurry of barley, a chunk of dried fish, a side of raw onion, maybe a date, if you were lucky. And picture someone eating it quietly, in the shadow of a stone wall, under a sky that promised sun, but not comfort. That's where real Egyptian food lived, between hunger and habit, in the narrow space where survival had to be enough. It's easy to forget how much work went into making bad food. Ancient Egyptian meals weren't simply dull, they were labor-intensive, built on hours of grinding, hauling, sifting, mixing, baking, boiling, and repeating. There were no shortcuts, no instant mixes, no pre-washed anything. Every bite came at a cost of time, energy, and in many cases, physical wear. Take grain. Before it became bread, it had to be threshed by hand, then winnowed to separate the husks, then ground down with a saddle quern, a flat stone, and a handheld one, over and over until the kernels broke down into flour. This wasn't a 5-minute chore. It was daily, repetitive, and backbreaking, knees on stone, hands blistered. And because the grinding surfaces were rough and porous, the resulting flour often contained microscopic grit and stone, enough to erode teeth over the years, even in children. Once the flour was made, it still had to be mixed, sometimes fermented, and baked in clay ovens fueled by dried reeds, dung, or leftover chaff. Ovens had no temperature gauge. Bakers relied on instinct, habit, and often guesswork. Burn it, and you wasted the batch. Undercook it, and the bread might go moldy faster. Every step required attention, precision, without precision tools. And it wasn't just bread. Beer, their other staple, had its own exhausting process. Bread was baked specifically for brewing, undercooked loaves mixed with water, and allowed to ferment in open jars. The result? A thick, cloudy, porridge-like drink with floating bread chunks, not particularly tasty, definitely not refreshing, but it was safer than the Nile, and it provided calories and hydration in a single gulp. Vegetables, when available, were cleaned by hand, boiled in basic clay pots, and seasoned with whatever could be spared, mostly onions, garlic, and perhaps a pinch of salt. That's it. No spices unless you were very wealthy. No oil unless you were lucky. And even then oil was expensive. Often saved for lighting lamps instead of frying leeks. This level of manual labor extended to meat and fish too, if you were fortunate enough to have it. Fish had to be caught, cleaned, dried, or salted before it spoiled in the heat. Meat was rarer, often reserved for feasts, offerings, or elites. And when animals were slaughtered, every part was used. Organs, blood, feet, nothing wasted. Bones were boiled down for broth. Skin might be tanned or discarded. There was no waste because there was no surplus. Even collecting water was a task. It had to be drawn, carried, filtered with cloth to remove sediment. There were no wells in every home, no pumps, just time and sweat, spent to secure the most basic needs. So while the food may have tasted bland, coarse, or even unpleasant, it was never effortless. Every simple meal was layered with effort and shaped by necessity. Eating wasn't an indulgence. It was the end of a long daily grind. And tomorrow, they'd start the process all over again. Imagine eating the same thing every day, not just for a week or a month, but for a lifetime. Morning, noon, and night. some variation of grain and legumes. That was the norm for most ancient Egyptians. And while repetition can be comforting, this kind of culinary monotony wore thin fast. Welcome to the flat, dry, and mostly brown diet of a civilization that built wonders while chewing the same bite over and over. Beans were a cornerstone. Not out of love, but necessity. Lentils, chickpeas, and fava beans were cheap, filling, and easy to grow. They were ground into pastes, boiled into stews, or simply eaten plain. But here's the problem. Without much in the way of seasoning, those beans tasted exactly like what they were, muddy, dense, and earthy to the point of being overwhelming. The side effects weren't pleasant either. Flatulence was a given, digestion was a gamble, and any shared living space likely smelled like a chamber pot in the midday sun. There are no surviving air fresheners from the 18th dynasty, but if there had been, they would have sold well. Before we go further, make yourself comfortable. And if you're enjoying this journey through forgotten corners of history, consider subscribing. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see how far this quiet little world reaches. There's no surviving cookbook from ancient Egypt, but we can piece together a rough outline of daily meals from tomb paintings, grain samples, and scattered texts. And one thing becomes clear. Spices were scarce. Salt, maybe. Wild herbs, occasionally. But the robust spice trade wouldn't kick in until much later. That meant meals were built around what you could grow or trap locally, and those options didn't always scream flavor. Some households had clay ovens and rudimentary cooking pots. Others relied on open fires or shared village hearths. Meals weren't private affairs. They were communal and basic, with few ingredients and fewer variations. A pot of lentils, some flatbread, maybe an onion if you were lucky. The wealthy had more options: fish, meat, dates, honey. But the average diet was utilitarian, designed to keep you alive, not to delight. Still, there was a quiet resilience in that routine. Preparing the same foods, day after day, was a ritual in itself. Grinding the grain, fetching water, stirring the stew. These actions were part of the rhythm of life, as foundational as the rising sun or the flood of the Nile. Repetitive, yes, but grounding. Predictable in a world that often wasn't. So while the food may have sucked by today's standards, it served its purpose. It kept people standing, working, worshiping, building, dreaming. And when the flood came and the harvest held, maybe they didn't mind so much that dinner tasted the same as breakfast. At least there was dinner. At least there was bread. Hunger wasn't always dramatic. In ancient Egypt, it was often quiet, settling into bones and bellies like dust on stone. It wasn't always famine that wore people down. Sometimes it was the endless repetition of thin meals, the gnawing absence of richness, and the slow erosion of joy that came from eating the same thing every day without change. Vegetables were seasonal, and seasons were unreliable. Cucumbers, leeks, radishes, garlic. If they grew, they were eaten. If not, people went without. There was no refrigeration, no pickling for the masses. Most things were eaten fresh or dried. If it spoiled, it was gone. Preservation was a luxury, not a norm. Meat, too, was rare, not just because of cost, but because of scarcity. The average laborer might eat meat a few times a year, during festivals, sacrifices, or funerals. When an animal was slaughtered, it was a communal event. Bones were boiled down, organs were cooked quickly. Nothing was wasted. It wasn't about savoring. It was about stretching. A single duck could feed a household if you worked hard enough to make the scraps count. Before we go further, make yourself comfortable. And if you're enjoying this journey through forgotten corners of history, consider subscribing. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see how far this quiet little world reaches. Even fish, which the Nile provided in abundance, wasn't guaranteed. During droughts or poor floods, fish numbers dropped. Netting took time. Salting fish took effort. And when it arrived at the table, it was often dried, chewy, and barely distinguishable from the net it came in. Protein was precious. You didn't ask how it tasted. You were just glad it was there. Children grew up on this diet. Their first solid food was often a mash of grain or lentils, easy to digest, harder to enjoy. Old people died with worn teeth and swollen gums, having chewed their way through decades of hard bread and boiled legumes. There were no dentists, no soft food menus, just endurance. Still, mealtime had meaning. Even a bowl of mush shared among 5 people could be sacred. Families gathered. Work paused. Rituals, however small, unfolded. A prayer, a shared jug of beer, a hand passing flatbread to someone too tired to reach. This was how a civilization sustained itself, not with variety or pleasure, but with perseverance. The food might not have inspired poetry, but it filled stomachs long enough to build temples, raise children, and tell stories under the stars. And sometimes, when the barley sprouted just right, or a neighbor had more than they needed, there might be something extra. A drizzle of honey, a handful of dates, a moment of sweetness, enough to remind you that even in the sameness, something good could still break through. Luxury in ancient Egypt wasn't always golden jewelry or imported incense. Sometimes it was a fig, or a slab of honeycomb, or a fresh fish that hadn't been dried into leathery oblivion. For most Egyptians, food luxury meant anything outside the usual circuit of coarse bread, lentils, and beer porridge. And even those tiny upgrades were rare, treats reserved for festivals, bribes, or the most sacred of offerings. Fruits were coveted, dates, figs, and occasionally grapes. But they were seasonal and perishable, and transporting them any significant distance required care and speed. When available, they were eaten quickly, before rot set in, and cherished more for their sweetness than their substance. A fresh date in a peasant's hand was less a snack and more a miracle. Meat was rarer still, not because animals weren't around. Egypt was full of cattle, geese, ducks, and fish, but because they were more useful alive. Cows plowed fields, birds laid eggs, goats gave milk. Killing an animal was expensive, wasteful. So when meat appeared at a meal, it meant something important had happened. A birth, a funeral, a tax official's unexpected generosity. Before we go further, make yourself comfortable. And if you're enjoying this journey through forgotten corners of history, consider subscribing. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see how far this quiet little world reaches. One way to access these luxuries was through temple service. The great temples of Egypt weren't just spiritual hubs. They were economic engines. They owned land, collected taxes, stored grain, and yes, distributed food. Working for a temple meant steady meals, sometimes even variety. Ritual leftovers from offerings to the gods were redistributed among the priesthood and staff. If you were lucky, you might end up with a piece of roasted duck that had first been blessed by incense and hymns. But, for the vast majority, luxury food was mythic, something heard about, but rarely tasted. Recipes weren't written down for the masses. Instructions were passed orally, if at all. And the most elaborate dishes, sweetened breads, fruit pastes, honey cakes, were prepared only in wealthy households or palace kitchens, guarded by status and secrecy. Even beer, the cornerstone of the everyday diet, had fancier versions. Special brews were made for festivals or religious events, stronger and slightly more refined, though still nothing like what we'd call pleasant. The difference between everyday and elite wasn't always what you ate, but how it was made and who got to eat it without needing permission. Food inequality wasn't subtle. It was carved in stone, painted in tombs, recorded in the layout of feasts that only the elite attended. In one scene, a servant pours wine, while another presents grilled fish and pastries. In another, laborers chew dry bread in the shadow of a granary they're not allowed to enter. Luxury in Egypt was edible, but only for a few. For everyone else, it was something to hope for, dream about, or smell from a distance as it cooked in someone else's pot. A clay bowl. That's what most meals came down to. Not silver platters or engraved trays, just a battered clay bowl filled with something warm, mushy, and usually brown. In a culture that worshipped the afterlife, food in this life was a quiet, functional thing, not flashy, not luxurious, just consistent. Clay bowls carried lentils, barley stew, crushed garlic, watery beer. And they did so for centuries, without complaint. The average household had a few of them, some chipped, some cracked, all reused until they broke completely. They weren't personalized or precious, but they were essential. People didn't eat with forks or knives. They scooped, dipped, and drank their food. Bread functioned as a spoon. Fingers did the rest. A meal wasn't a separate event. It blended into the day, into the rhythm of work and rest and more work. Cooking didn't mean recipes. It meant survival. Start with what you had. Grind the grain. Add water. Boil it if there was fuel. Eat it before it spoiled. Repeat. There was no refrigeration, no written measurements, just the same process passed down through generations. The same ingredients, the same textures, the same result. Before we go further, make yourself comfortable. And if you're enjoying this journey through forgotten corners of history, consider subscribing. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see how far this quiet little world reaches. There was a kind of humility in the ancient Egyptian kitchen, if you could even call it that. Most people cooked outside. Inside was too smoky, too small. Fires were built low to the ground, between stones, with pots balanced carefully on top. Ash clung to everything. The air smelled like smoke and boiled beans. Children ran past carrying more wood. Neighbors drifted over to share what they had, or didn't. You didn't eat alone if you could help it. Meals were shared. Not because there was so much, but because there was so little. One onion between 4 people. A few hunks of bread torn into smaller and smaller pieces. Eating was as much about presence as it was about nutrition. Who you sat with mattered just as much as what you ate, maybe more. Food may have been dull, but the act of eating was sacred in its own quiet way. It meant you were still alive, still here, still part of the long, slow churn of life beside the Nile. Clay bowls weren't glamorous, but they were enough. And sometimes, enough was everything. There were no desserts, at least not in the way we think of them today. No chocolate, no pastries, no ice cream waiting in a cold cellar. Sweetness in ancient Egypt was rare, fleeting, and often unrefined. If you craved something sweet, you had exactly one real option: honey. And unless you were wealthy, even that was more of a concept than a common ingredient. Most Egyptians had never tasted anything more indulgent than dates, dense, chewy, and sun-warmed from storage. Occasionally figs or carob pods were added to meals, but there was no sugar to speak of. No candy to nibble on after dinner, no syrup to drizzle over your bread, just the natural sweetness that clung to fruit harvested during good years and dried for longevity. Honey, when available, was sacred. It was used in offerings to gods, mixed into medicines, and occasionally worked into celebratory cakes, if you had the grain and time to spare. But for most people, it wasn't part of the kitchen. It was part of religion. And when the gods got their share, there was usually little left for everyone else. Before we go further, make yourself comfortable. And if you're enjoying this journey through forgotten corners of history, consider subscribing. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see how far this quiet little world reaches. We tend to imagine ancient feasts as lavish affairs. Golden goblets, overflowing platters, dancers, musicians. But those images were crafted for tomb walls and temples, not kitchens. For the average Egyptian, food was simple, repetitive, and survival-based. Even celebrations, harvest festivals, births, marriages, offered only modest breaks from the usual fare. Maybe some extra beer, maybe a few dried fruits, maybe honey if someone pulled strings or paid tribute. They didn't bake cookies or spoon out custards. Their ovens weren't temperature controlled, and their ingredients weren't measured with precision. They mixed grain, water, maybe fruit, and heat. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. But there was no such thing as a treat for treat's sake. Every calorie had to count. Even the concept of fullness was different. People ate to keep going, to have enough energy for labor, prayer, and another long walk to the field or river. There was no dessert course. There was just the end of the bowl. And maybe, if you were lucky, something just a little sweet to hold on to. That was enough. Every bite was borrowed time. That's how it felt when you lived in ancient Egypt and relied on bread, beer, and whatever the harvest allowed. Because under every meal, no matter how plain, there was always a question. Would the next flood come? Would the grain hold? Would the stomach quiet or growl louder? There wasn't much choice. You ate what the land gave you or what it failed to. Even when it gave, the gifts were humble. Flat bread like stone, bitter beer like porridge, onions so strong they stung your eyes open. Variety was for the rich. For everyone else, meals were a ritual of necessity. And yet, food meant everything. Not because it was delicious, but because it was constant. A marker of survival. A shared thread across generations. The act of eating, grinding the flour, shaping the dough, boiling the legumes, was an echo of your ancestors. Your grandmother did it. Her grandmother did too. You didn't need a cookbook. The recipe was your life. Before we go further, make yourself comfortable. And if you're enjoying this journey through forgotten corners of history, consider subscribing. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see how far this quiet little world reaches. Still, even that routine came with risks. Teeth were worn flat by age 20, jaws inflamed. Stones and sand crept into every loaf of bread from the grinding stones used to mill the grain. The average person in ancient Egypt didn't die with a smile. They died missing molars, their gums worn raw from years of chewing grit. And then there were the famines, the lean years, the floods that didn't come or came too hard. A year with too much Nile was as dangerous as a year with none. Crops drowned, silos emptied, people turned to lotus roots, dried fish, anything edible. Sometimes even that wasn't enough. When food failed, faith had to carry the weight. Rituals intensified. Priests begged the gods for mercy. Offerings multiplied. Anything to restore the balance. Because in Egypt, balance was survival. Ma'at wasn't just an idea. It was dinner on the table. So yes, the food sucked. But it was never just about taste. It was about endurance. It was about waking up and doing it again. Grinding, baking, boiling, chewing, surviving. And in the end, maybe that was the real flavor of ancient Egypt. Persistence, seasoned with dust and swallowed in silence. Preservation was a constant concern. In a land where the sun could boil water in its jug and rot set in quickly, ancient Egyptians had to find ways to keep their food from turning into a health hazard. There were no ice boxes, no clay fridges, no magic cooling stones, just the heat, the air, and whatever methods people could figure out to stretch the life of what little they had. Drying was the most common solution. Fish, for example, wasn't a delicacy. It was an emergency ration. Caught in bulk and left to dry out under the same sun that threatened to spoil it, fish became stiff, salted slabs of protein. It was functional, but not enjoyable. Dried fish shows up everywhere in records and tomb art, which means it was either beloved or just inescapable. Probably the latter. Meat, when available, faced the same dilemma. Without preservation, it had to be eaten immediately or cured with salt, smoked over a fire, or stored with layers of ash or sand. That worked, sometimes. But often, meat was just out of reach for the average person. Livestock were too valuable alive. Chickens didn't even exist in Egypt until the very late period. So for centuries, the idea of meat at every meal was as fantastical as flying chariots. Before we go further, make yourself comfortable. And if you're enjoying this journey through forgotten corners of history, consider subscribing. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see how far this quiet little world reaches. Instead, Egyptians leaned on storage. Clay pots sealed with mud or wax, baskets woven tight to keep out bugs, granaries lifted off the ground to avoid rodents. But even the best stored food changed over time. Bread went stale quickly, and beer spoiled fast in the heat. You didn't store it for long. You consumed it quickly and made more. Fruits were sometimes sun-dried. Dates, figs, and carob were turned into thick pastes or balls and stored in jars. These were the sweet spots in the Egyptian diet, literally. Rare, rich in calories, and used sparingly, they acted as dessert, energy bar, and religious offering all in one. Food preservation wasn't just about survival. It was about control. Grain was power. Whoever stored it, guarded it, and rationed it effectively had influence. Temples didn't just hold statues and incense, they held food supplies. Scribes didn't just write prayers, they logged inventory. Hunger shaped loyalty. A well-fed village was a compliant one. A starving one could riot. In a world where food could vanish with one failed flood or one swarm of pests, preservation was less about flavor and more about structure. It kept the system intact. It kept belief intact. It kept people just fed enough to keep moving stones, worshiping gods, and showing up at dawn to do it all again. So no, their food didn't last long, but their systems did. And in a way, that was the real recipe for survival. It's easy to romanticize ancient food. The idea of clay ovens, hand-ground grain, communal meals under open skies, it sounds almost idyllic. But the reality was grimmer, especially near the end of Egypt's golden age, when the system started to stretch thin, and cracks began to show in both the bureaucracy and the bread. By this point, Egypt had grown complex, too complex. More mouths to feed, more temples to supply, more armies to sustain. Food was still central, still sacred, but it had become harder to manage. Droughts became more frequent, floods more unpredictable, and all the careful storage and rationing that once kept the machine running started to fall apart. Grain shortages were no longer rare events. They were expected. Temple stores were guarded like treasuries, but corruption seeped in anyway. Officials skimmed off rations. Farmers were taxed into desperation. What little was left over often went to the elite, who still enjoyed honey-glazed pastries and imported wine while laborers chewed bitter bread crusts and stared into empty jars. People started cutting corners. Bread wasn't just hard. It was hollow, bulked out with chaff or leftover husks. Beer became watery, barely fermented, stripped of the calories that once made it a lifeline. And meals shrank. That modest bowl of lentils became half a bowl. That smear of onion paste got thinner and thinner. Before we go further, make yourself comfortable. And if you're enjoying this journey through forgotten corners of history, consider subscribing. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see how far this quiet little world reaches. With hardship came superstition. People blamed spirits, omens, bad astrology. More offerings were made to the gods, more onions, more beer, more bread shaped into ritual forms. But even the gods seemed tired. Temple statues were no longer clothed in fresh linens or anointed with oils. Even the offerings grew stale. Families stretched food any way they could. Crushed reeds, wild greens, even the bark of certain trees found their way into stews. It didn't have to taste good. It just had to go down. Hunger doesn't leave much room for taste. And yet, life went on. People still gathered for meals, still gave thanks for the little they had, still told stories between mouthfuls of rough bread and bitter beer. Even in decline, Egypt held on to its routines. Maybe that's the most remarkable part. The food may have gotten worse, the politics more tangled, the floods less reliable, but people kept grinding the grain, baking the loaves, and showing up for dinner. Even if dinner wasn't much more than a handful of crumbs and a hope for better water next season. They didn't have forks. That's not the tragedy. It's the texture. Most meals in ancient Egypt were eaten with fingers, or scooped up with bread acting as both utensil and carbohydrate. This worked fine if you were dunking into something soft, lentils, mashed beans, or beer-thick gruel. But when the meal got more complex, or just more solid, things got trickier. Tough meat, dried fish, or anything baked until it was more brick than bread required teeth and hands working together like tools. It wasn't fine dining. It was excavation. Seated low to the ground, around shared pots or baskets, families ate quickly and without ceremony. There were no courses, no silver trays, just food and the fingers you were born with. You didn't ask for a better plate. You were lucky to have one at all. Many used pieces of pottery or woven mats, sometimes even leaves. Nothing was wasted, and nothing was elegant. Before we go further, make yourself comfortable. And if you're enjoying this journey through forgotten corners of history, consider subscribing. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see how far this quiet little world reaches. Table manners? Sparse. Silence was likely common, not because of etiquette, but because chewing coarse bread and fibrous plants took work. Conversation required effort, and effort was reserved for digestion. Children learned to eat by watching, and what they saw was a family focused on the mechanics of consumption more than the aesthetics. Some wealthier Egyptians had low tables, stools, and maybe even servants to bring food in bowls or jars. But that wasn't the norm. For most, everything was communal and self-served. You tore, dipped, bit, and moved on. And then came the cleanup. Or rather, the lack of it. Water was precious. Soap didn't exist. People rinsed their hands with river water, or wiped them on cloth, leaves, or their own robes. Leftovers weren't refrigerated. They were left out, or fed to animals. Insects, dust, and heat meant you either finished quickly or took your chances. It's easy to romanticize the past, but when you look closely, when you imagine the textures, the temperatures, the clumsiness, it's clear. Mealtime wasn't magical. It was practical, messy, often frustrating, and always a reminder that survival was the only flavor that really mattered. They built pyramids, yes, but they also ate sand. Not on purpose, of course, but when your bread is filled with stone grit from hand-ground flour, it ends up in your stomach whether you like it or not. And after all the gods, the ceremonies, the gold leaf and linen, that's the part that lingers. The ordinary, unromantic truth that while ancient Egypt crafted wonders, most of its people chewed through their lives with worn-down teeth and empty spice racks. By the end of this journey, you've probably noticed a pattern. Meals weren't designed for pleasure. They were designed for function. Keep the body going. Get to the next flood. Hope the bread doesn't break your molars. There were exceptions. Wealth, luck, location. But most people didn't taste variety. They didn't crave it because they'd never known it. They fed themselves on the same dense bread and the same lukewarm beer, day in, day out. And yet, there's something quietly remarkable about that. A civilization fueled by carbs and determination. The same people who aligned temples with stars, who painted gods with bird heads and jackal faces, who preserved bodies for thousands of years, ate lentils and onions and called it enough. Before we close the book, make yourself comfortable. And if you've made it this far, thank you for spending your time in this quiet little corner of the ancient world. If you're still awake, I hope it's because your mind wandered, not because the story did. And if you're already asleep, well, that's the whole point, isn't it? The food in ancient Egypt wasn't good. It wasn't even interesting. But it fed a people who made history, who left their stories in stone, who whispered through layers of sand and silence just loud enough for us to hear. So tonight, if you're lying in bed thinking about the past, remember, it wasn't all gold and glory. Most of it was bread and beer, and even the gods needed lunch.